On the far edge of the frontier, where the land is wide and the nights are long, a cowboy lived alone, his heart scarred, his home silent. He turned away every bride, every kindness, until one winter evening, when an Apache beauty knocked upon his door. The wind carried the bite of winter across the wide plains, sharp and restless, rattling the shutters of Eli Cutter's house. The boards groaned with each gust as if the place itself remembered better days and resented the man who kept it alive in solitude. Eli sat near the fire, boots planted firmly on the worn plank floor, a tin cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He stared into the flames, though he did not see them. He saw instead the empty rocking chair beside the hearth, the faint curve worn into its arms by hands that had not graced it in years. The ranch was quiet now, save for the shifting timbers and the low whistle of wind through the chimney. Once laughter had filled the rooms, soft humming while supper cooked, the whisper of skirts brushing across the floor. Those sounds had been carried off with the woman he buried beneath the cottonwoods. He had built walls around his grief since then, hard as stone. The town had tried to pull him back. Women approached, some with kindness, others with ambition, all believing themselves strong enough to thaw the man he had become. He had refused them all one by one with the same steady words. "I'm not the man you're looking for." Some called him proud, others cold, but he carried no guilt in their judgment. Better rejection than a false promise. It was in that silence, his chosen prison, that the sound of hooves cut through the wind. Eli's head lifted. He set the cup aside, stood and reached for the rifle leaning by the door. Travelers were rare this late in the season, and rarer still when the sky threatened snow. The sound grew nearer until a lone figure emerged through the drifting dusk. A horse, dark-coated and weary, carried a rider wrapped in a blanket of earth tones. The rider swayed with exhaustion yet sat upright, proud even in weariness. As the horse halted in the yard, Eli saw her clearly, a young woman, hair braided long, her face marked with strength that did not ask for permission. Apache. Eli's jaw tightened. The memory stirred. Raids, border skirmishes, the whisper of men lost to conflict. His hand flexed against the stock of the rifle. Still the woman dismounted slowly, careful not to startle him or the horse. She held no weapon in her hands, only a calm defiance in her dark eyes. "I need shelter," she said simply, her voice steady despite the wind's bite. Eli studied her. He could have turned her away, sent her back into the oncoming storm. Many men would have. Yet something in her gaze stilled him, the look of someone who had already been turned away too many times and learned to stand tall in rejection. He opened the door with a curt gesture. "Come in, then." The woman stepped across the threshold, removing the blanket from her shoulders. Snowflakes melted against her braid. The fire's glow painted her face in shades of bronze and shadow. She carried herself with a composure that unsettled him. He had seen women arrive at his door before, faces painted with hope or desperation. This one carried neither. She expected nothing from him. Eli set the rifle aside and returned to the hearth. "You can warm there." She moved closer to the fire, stretching her hands toward it. He noticed the faint scars across her knuckles, the steady way she breathed, as if she would not show weakness even to the flames. He poured black coffee into a second cup and set it on the table between them. She looked at it, then at him, and finally accepted with a slight nod. The silence between them thickened. Outside, the wind clawed against the house, rattling the walls, but inside, the quiet was heavier still. Eli stole glances at her while pretending to watch the fire. She sat with dignity, her blanket draped neatly across her lap, her braid glinting in the firelight. "What's your name?" he asked at last, his voice low, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile truce between them. "Naiche," she replied. Her eyes met his steadily, unflinching. "And yours?" "Cutter." "Eli Cutter." Another silence fell, though not as sharp as the first. He studied the scar across her cheekbone, faint but telling. She studied the empty rocking chair as though sensing the ghost that lingered there. "You ride far?" he asked, more to fill the space than from real need to know. "Far enough," she said. She offered nothing more, and he did not press her. The fire cracked. The coffee cooled. The weight of years hung in the room, his grief against her unknown burdens, two shadows stretching across the floorboards. At last, Eli leaned back, arms crossed. "I don't keep company," he said flatly, the old warning rising unbidden. Naiche sipped her coffee without looking at him. "Then don't." The words struck him like a thrown stone, sharp, direct, leaving no wound yet no room for pity. She did not ask to belong, did not ask to mend what was broken. She asked only for shelter, nothing more. For the first time in years, Eli Cutter felt something stir inside him. Not warmth, not yet, but the faint crack in a wall long thought unbreakable. He had spent so long fearing intrusion, so long rejecting brides who saw him as half a man to be completed, yet this woman had stepped into his house without asking to complete anything. She carried her own wholeness, her own scars. Outside, the storm deepened, the sky heavy with snow. Inside, two figures sat by the fire, bound not by words but by silence. Eli Cutter realized then that for all his barricades, for all his cold refusals, he could not turn her away. Not tonight, not into that storm, and though he did not yet understand why, the truth settled heavy on his chest. The fortress of solitude he had built might not withstand the presence of Naiche. The storm passed in the night, leaving the land brittle and still, wrapped in white. Snow crusted the fence rails, clung to the eaves, and buried the path that wound toward the far pastures. Eli Cutter stepped outside at dawn, breath rising in sharp clouds. The world looked clean, but he knew better. Snow only covered what was already broken. Behind him, Naiche lingered near the doorway, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She said nothing, only watched him with unreadable eyes. Her presence pressed against the silence of the land, not unwelcome but unsettling in ways Eli could not name. Inside, his nights had grown restless. When the fire burned low and shadows stretched across the ceiling, memories stirred, his wife's voice humming a tune as she braided her hair, the ribbon she tied at the end fluttering as she leaned over her work. He remembered her shawl, pale and soft, hanging still upon the peg by the door. He had never moved it, as though removing it would scatter her from memory. The hardest to bear was the quilt, half-stitched, folded in a cedar trunk at the foot of the bed. Her hands had begun at the spring before the wagon ride. She never finished. The trunk smelled faintly of cedar, but to Eli it carried the ghost of her, as though every thread still clung to her touch. He touched his chest sometimes, where the scar cut across his ribs. The ambush had come sudden, rifles cracking through the air, shouts tearing the day apart. He had been thrown to the dirt, his wife pulled from him in a flash of terror. By the time the gunfire ended, she was gone. He carried nothing of her now but memory, a scar and silence. That silence stretched between him and Naiche like the wide prairie. She did not pry, did not soften her gaze with questions. She worked beside him without invitation, fetching water, tending the fire, her movements sure and deliberate. She carried her own shadows. He could see it in the way her eyes lingered on the horizon at dusk, as though counting ghosts. One night, while the wind rattled loose shingles, Eli found her sitting by the fire, fingers weaving her hair into long braids. She did it with reverence, each strand pulled tight, each knot deliberate. He realized then what the braids meant. Not vanity, but memory, tradition woven into her very body. She carried her dead with her in that braid the way he carried his wife's shawl on the peg. He spoke without thinking. You lost someone, her hands stilled only for a heartbeat. Everyone loses someone. It was the only answer she gave, but the weight of it settled heavy between them. He did not ask again. The days bled together. Snow melted and froze again, leaving ice hard as stone. Eli rose each morning to chores. The livestock needed tending, the tools mending, the fences patched where rot had taken the posts. One afternoon, he found a corner of the north fence broken clean, rails scattered by the last storm. He set about the work alone, axe in hand, cutting a replacement post from the stack he kept beneath the shed. When he hauled it toward the break, Naiche followed. She carried nothing at first, only her blanket wrapped around her, but as he bent to fit the post, she reached for the hammer, lifted it with steady hands, and held the rail while he drove the nails. The sound of iron striking wood echoed across the still air. No words passed between them. She stood close enough that he could hear her breath, see the faint scars along her wrists, the small tremor in her fingers as she steadied the rail. It was not weakness, only memory perhaps, the kind that trembles even when the body stands strong. Together they set the post. Together they bound it firm. When the last nail was driven, they stepped back side by side and studied the fence. The post stood straight, stubborn against the wind. Eli felt something shift in that moment, not in the fence, but in himself. For years he had patched things alone. Alone he had mended roofs. Alone he had fixed saddles. Alone he had carried the weight of memory. Now, without a word, someone else's hands had steadied the rail. Naiche brushed the sawdust from her palms. She did not smile, nor did he. Yet something unspoken passed between them, as steady as the new post, as certain as the earth beneath their boots. That night by the fire, their silence felt changed. Not lighter, but shared. She braided her hair as always. He sharpened a knife that had dulled with use. The shawl still hung on its peg. The quilt still slept unfinished in the cedar chest, but for the first time in years, Eli Cutter felt that grief did not need to be carried alone. Neither said so. Neither needed to. The snow outside deepened, heavy as clouds, but within the cabin, a fragile bridge had begun to form. The storm came sudden, as if the heavens had torn open their anger all at once. By afternoon, the horizon had turned black, a bruised sky pressing down on the plains. The air carried a charge sharp enough to sting the skin, and then the wind came, howling low and fierce, bending the sparse trees until they creaked in pain. Eli Cutter barred the shutters tight, though the old wood groaned against each gust. Inside, the cabin glowed dimly with firelight. Shadows wavered across the log walls, dancing to the rhythm of the storm. Rain drove itself through every crack it could find, dripping down in crooked lines, pooling on the floorboards. Eli set buckets beneath the leaks, his movements practiced from years of fighting weather and losing more often than not. Naiche moved quietly behind him. She pulled beans from a sack, set a pot over the fire, her motions sure and economical. She stirred without hurry, adding herbs he did not recognize, though the aroma soon filled the small room. Eli paused in his work to watch her, the way she bent close to test the steam, the calm steadiness of her hand. He had forgotten what it felt like to share a roof with someone whose presence softened the edges of hardship. Lightning cracked across the sky, white fire spilling through the shutter slats. Thunder followed, rolling like cannon fire across the plains. The horse in the lean-to whinnied and stamped, unsettled. Eli checked the rifle by the door out of habit, though no storm could be shot away. It was then the pounding came, not thunder but fists against the door. Eli froze, every muscle gone taut. Visitors did not come in storms like this. The pounding came again, louder, urgent. He reached for the rifle, lifted it into his arms, and approached the door. His voice was steady, though his pulse was not. "Who's there?" A voice slurred by drink and rain answered, rough and sharp. "Cold night, friend, open up. A man's got no wish to drown out here." Eli glanced at Naiche. She stood near the hearth, shoulders squared, eyes sharp on him, not the door. Her hand lingered near the knife she'd used for cooking. She said nothing, but the steadiness in her gaze was enough. Eli cracked the door just wide enough to see. A man stood hunched against the downpour, water running in rivulets down his hat brim. His coat hung heavy, his face shadowed, but the glint of steel at his belt was plain. "I don't keep company," Eli said flatly. The man shoved at the door, but Eli braced it with his shoulder. "Come now, Cutter. You'd leave a man to die in this? Ain't Christian." Eli's grip tightened on the rifle. He had not given his name. The outlaw leaned closer, eyes glinting beneath the brim. "Word goes far, Cutter. The cold-hearted cowboy all alone with his ghosts." He grinned, teeth flashing in the lightning. "But I hear you ain't so alone now." Eli's stomach nodded. Rumor carried faster than wind in these parts, and if this drifter knew of Naiche's presence, others would soon enough. "You've had your word," Eli said. He shoved the man back a step and slammed the door, dropping the bar into place. The fists returned at once, hammering loud enough to rattle the frame. Naiche's knife flashed in her hand, but she stood still as stone, eyes fixed on Eli. Eli raised the rifle and leveled it at the door. "Get off my land," he bellowed, voice rising above thunder. For a breath the pounding stopped. Then came laughter, ragged and mean, fading into the storm. Footsteps splashed through the mud, retreating into darkness. Eli waited, rifle steady, listening through the roar of rain. Only the storm remained. He lowered the weapon, set it against the wall, and let out the breath he had been holding. Naiche slid the knife back into her belt. She had not flinched once. The night stretched long after that. Rain hammered without mercy, the roof leaking, the shutters straining against each gust. Yet the silence between them felt changed. Not the wary quiet of strangers, but the shared silence of survivors who had faced the same threat. Eli sat by the fire, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the flicker of shadows. Naiche sat opposite him, her face calm though the storm raged as if it would tear the world apart. She braided her hair again, slow and deliberate, the firelight catching each strand, toward dawn. When the thunder rolled farther away and the rain softened to a weary drizzle, Eli looked up and found her still awake. She sat steady, eyes fixed on the fire, posture unbowed by fatigue. For the first time since she had crossed his threshold, Eli Cutter saw her not as a guest, not as a trespasser, but as an equal, a survivor who carried her own storms and met them without bending. He realized then that solitude, for all its armor, could not shield him from the dangers of the world. Nor could it warm him against the cold nights. Trust was risk, but perhaps it was the only shelter that truly lasted. The storm outside passed, leaving the land drenched and raw. But the storm within Eli had only begun to shift, breaking down the barricades he had sworn never to lower, and in the quiet of that dawn, he knew one truth. Naiche was no passing traveler. She was carved from the same iron as the land, and her presence in his cabin had already altered the course of his life. The storm broke, but the unease it left behind did not pass. Days stretched long in the cold aftermath, skies gray and heavy with lingering winter. Eli Cutter and Naiche shared the cabin as if it were divided into two unseen halves, his side marked by the tools, the rocking chair, the rifle propped against the door, hers by the quiet weaving of braids, the faint scent of herbs she boiled into teas. They lived in a rhythm that was not quite peace and not quite strife. Eli sharpened his knives, oiled the saddle leather, mended hinges with deliberate hands. Naiche sat near the fire each evening, combing and braiding her long black hair. Each motion precise and unhurried, the strands catching firelight like dark water. Neither intruded upon the other's silence, yet both were aware of the weight of it pressing down. Word from the town reached Eli soon enough, carried by a neighbor who stopped at the fence line, reluctant to come nearer. The man's voice was wrapped in false cheer, but the warning lay underneath. "Folks say you've got company," the neighbor remarked, eyes flicking toward the cabin. Not the sort they look kindly on. Eli dismissed him with a cold stare, but the words lingered long after the man rode off. The town was not generous with its tolerance. It would not take much for resentment to turn dangerous. That night, Eli sat at the table cleaning his revolver. The metal gleamed beneath the lamplight, the soft scrape of cloth steady in his hands. Naiche moved about the cabin in silence, tidying the bowls, folding the blanket she had used near the fire. He caught her gaze once, brief, unreadable, before she turned away. Later, when he rose to fetch another log for the fire, his steps halted. She stood near the door, shawl in her hands. His wife's shawl, the pale wool hung soft and fragile, the edges worn from years of touch. Naiche held it gently, as though it might dissolve between her fingers. Her expression was not possessive, not careless, but reverent, like one paying respects at a grave. Still, Eli's chest tightened with fury. The words spilled before he could stop them. "Put that down." She turned, startled by the sharpness in his voice. The shawl slipped from her fingers, landing across the peg once more. Her face did not flinch, but her eyes burned steady into his. "It belonged to my wife," he said, harsher than he intended. "You've no right." The silence that followed cut deeper than any argument. Naiche said nothing, only stepped away from the door, her back straight, her braid brushing against her shoulders. She sat once more by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the flames. Eli stood rigid, anger fading into shame. He had spoken like a man defending a wound too tender to be touched, but in his outburst he had only revealed his weakness. The shawl was not sacred because of wool or thread. It was sacred because of memory, and he feared losing even that to the presence of another. Sleep came slow that night. When at last it did, dreams stirred. He saw his wife as she had been, hair loose around her shoulders, smile faint but warm, her eyes steady as she placed her hand over his scarred chest. In the dream, she did not scold. She did not weep. She only whispered, "Let go." Eli woke before dawn, breath ragged, the fire's embers faint against the dark. He rose quietly, stepping outside to breathe the cold air. The land stretched endless, snow still clinging to the hollows. He stood there until the frost burned his lungs, then returned inside. Naiche was awake already. She sat at the table, his work shirt spread across her lap, a needle in her hand. The tear along the sleeve, earned days before when a fence nail caught him, was already half mended, her stitches small and even. He stopped in the doorway, watching her in silence. She did not look up, did not explain herself, only continued her work with quiet concentration. Each pull of thread bound cloth to cloth, patient, unhurried. Something eased in Eli's chest. The shawl still hung untouched upon its peg, his wife's memory unchallenged. Yet here, before him, another set of hands moved to mend what was torn, not out of pity, not out of intrusion, but out of simple grace. When she finished, she folded the shirt and set it neatly on the table. Her eyes met his then, calm and unyielding. She spoke no word, and none was needed. Eli crossed the room, took the shirt into his hands, and nodded once. A gesture small, yet weighted. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt the sharp edge of grief soften. If only by a fraction. The house remained the same, the rocking chair empty, the shawl still hanging, but within him something shifted. Trust was not yet born, nor forgiveness, but the beginning of both lingered in the stitched cloth, in the steady hands that had given him back a shirt hole again. Winter pressed harder with each passing day, the kind of cold that stiffened the boards of the house and set the cattle lowing restless through the night. Eli, Cutter, and Naiche fell into a rhythm neither had spoken aloud, mornings spent in chores, afternoons in small labors, evenings in the hush of firelight. He split wood, she stacked it. She boiled beans, he fetched water. They shared meals without extravagance, only the scrape of spoons and the slow warmth of coffee poured into tin cups. At night, the fire cracked in the hearth, filling the cabin with its low song. Eli sat at the table mending harness leather, his hands steady from long habit. Naiche sat near the fire, braiding her hair as always, the flames catching its sheen. They rarely spoke, but silence no longer carried the same weight. It had changed, grown softer, like a blanket that shielded rather than smothered. Yet peace was never long-lived on the frontier. The memory of the outlaw at their door lingered like a shadow at the edge of lamplight. Eli expected trouble. He oiled his rifle, checked his revolver, and kept his ear sharp for any sound beyond the wind. Trouble came one night when the snow lay deep and the moon rode high behind thin clouds. Eli was outside, checking the lean-to where the horse shifted restlessly when he heard it. The crunch of boots on frozen ground, too many to be mistaken for chance travelers. His hand went to his rifle before thought. Figures moved in the dark, 3 at least, their shapes blurred by shadows but their intent clear. Outlaws, come to settle what pride had been wounded when Eli turned their man away. Eli slipped inside, voice low and urgent. "They're here." Naiche rose at once, no hesitation in her eyes. She snatched her knife from the table, then reached for the spare rifle leaning near the wall. Her hands moved as though she had been preparing for this all along. The first shot cracked through the night, a bullet tearing into the cabin wall. Wood splintered, scattering across the floor. Eli shoved the lamp aside, plunging them into half-darkness lit only by firelight. "Keep low," he muttered. But Naiche did not cower. She crouched near the shutter, rifle steady, eyes calm despite the storm outside. When the next figure darted into the open, she fired. The crack split the air, and the outlaw tumbled into the snow, shouting as he fell. Eli felt a surge of something fierce, not just relief, but respect. This was no guest sheltered under his roof. This was a fighter, a survivor. The outlaws answered with gunfire, bullets slamming against the shutters, punching holes through wood. Eli returned fire through the narrow gaps, his rifle steady despite the ringing in his ears. The cabin filled with smoke and the acrid tang of powder. Time slowed into fragments, the flare of muzzle fire outside. Naiche's braid swaying as she moved from shutter to shutter. The low grunt of Eli's breath each time he pulled the trigger. Together they fought as if they had always done so. Her covering one angle, him the other, an unspoken rhythm guiding them. At last, silence fell, broken only by the wind keening over the drifts. One figure lay still in the snow. Another had fled limping into the dark. The third was nowhere to be seen, but Eli guessed he would not return. The cabin smelled of smoke and fear, though neither spoke of it. Eli lowered his rifle, ears ringing in the sudden quiet. His chest heaved, the scar across it burning as if memory itself had joined the fight. Naiche stood by the shutter, her rifle still in hand. Her face was calm, but when Eli looked closer, he saw her hand tremble ever so slightly against the wood. It was not weakness, but the body's betrayal after danger passes. Without thinking, Eli crossed the room. He set his hand over hers, steadying it against the shutter. His touch was firm, not possessive, the kind of gesture a man gives another soldier after battle. Her eyes lifted to his, dark and unreadable, and for a long moment neither moved. The fire snapped behind them, sparks leaping up the chimney. Eli felt something stir in him he had thought long buried. The warmth of connection, not sudden, not consuming, but the slow ember that glows after long cold. Naiche did not pull away. Her trembling stilled beneath his touch. The silence between them was louder than gunfire, filled with things neither dared name. At last he stepped back, clearing his throat. "They won't be back tonight," she nodded once, lowering the rifle. Her braid slid over her shoulder, catching the fire's glow. They tended the fire in silence, patched the holes in the shutters with scraps of wood, and sat once more at the table. Their coffee was cold, but they drank it anyway, hands still unsteady from the fight. Outside, the snow bore witness to blood and footprints. Inside, the air carried another kind of mark, the bond forged in the fire of danger, unspoken yet undeniable. Eli Cutter looked across the table at the woman who had fought beside him, and for the first time since his wife's passing, he felt not only the ache of loss but the possibility of something beyond it. Naiche's gaze met his, calm and unwavering. Love did not need to be spoken. It lived in the steadiness of her hands, the firelight on her face, the silence they now shared without fear. The fire between them was no blaze that consumed. It was the slow, steady burn of trust kindled in battle, the ember that promised warmth enough to endure the long winter ahead. Winter bled slowly into spring. The snows receded, leaving behind fields of brown earth, swollen rivers, and the first shoots of stubborn grass. The Cutter ranch, long a place of silence, now bore the signs of shared labor. Fence posts reinforced, the barn roof patched, the corral swept clean of snow and muck. Eli Cutter and Naiche moved through the days with quiet rhythm, their presence beside one another no longer strange but certain, like two shadows that always fell together when the sun crossed the yard. But the world beyond the ranch had not grown so gentle. Word had spread in town, rumors thick as dust spoken in saloons and at church doors. Some muttered of shame, others of betrayal. A few used words sharper, words that cut at Naiche's name, words meant to remind Eli of the gulf that should have stood between them. The first warning came from the storekeeper, a man not cruel, but cautious. "Cutter," he said quietly, bagging flour with trembling hands. "There's talk. Some men reckon you've forgotten who you are. They say you bring shame to decent folk, taking her in." Eli's jaw tightened. He said nothing, only paid for his supplies and left. But the words weighed heavy, not because he doubted Naiche's place, but because he knew talk could turn to fists and fists could turn to guns. Days later, that fear proved true. He rode into town for feed, Naiche beside him, her braid wrapped with leather to keep the wind from tangling it. The street grew still as they passed. Men leaned against posts, spitting into the dust, their eyes sharp and measuring. Women pulled children closer, whispering into small ears. The silence was louder than gunfire. At the hitching post, 3 men stepped forward. Outlaws once, or close enough to it, their faces familiar from 100 half-forgotten feuds. The tallest spoke, voice dripping with scorn. "You've gone soft, Cutter. Took a savage into your house, they say. Made her queen of the place." Naiche stood silent at Eli's side, her chin high, her gaze steady. She did not flinch, though their words sought to strip her of dignity. Eli dismounted slowly, boots settling in the dust. He stood square, eyes locked on the men.
"She's under my roof."
"That makes her under my protection." Laughter followed, bitter and sharp. "Your protection? You think your name still carries weight? You're half a ghost, Cutter, hiding in that cabin, talking to memories." The words struck true, but Eli did not bend. He had lived too long in silence, and silence had nearly buried him. Now he found his voice steady, iron-wrapped. "You want to test my word?" he asked. He set his hand on the rifle slung across his saddle, not in threat but in promise. "Step closer." The street held its breath. The men shifted, uneasy under the weight of his stance. Eli did not shout, did not bluster. He simply stood, scarred and weathered, a man who had lost all and found something worth defending again. Naiche said nothing, yet her stillness was as powerful as his rifle. She stood as though rooted to the earth, unmovable, her gaze burning into the men until they looked away. At last the tallest spat into the dust. "Ain't worth the bullet." He turned, the others following, muttering curses as they went. The crowd dispersed, shame pricking at their curiosity. Life in town resumed, though glances still followed Eli and Naiche as they walked. Yet no hand was raised, no stone thrown. The standoff had been won not by bloodshed, but by a man's unshakable word and a woman's unbroken dignity. When they rode home that evening, the air was sharp with thawing earth. The sun slid low, casting gold across the plains. Eli felt the weight of the day settle, not as burden but as release. The line had been drawn and he had chosen where to stand. At the ranch the house waited, familiar and changed all at once. Inside, the shawl still hung on its peg, pale against the dark logs. Eli paused before it, the fire's glow brushing the worn threads. For years it had hung there like a sentinel, a reminder of love lost, a relic of grief he could not set down. He lifted it now, folded it carefully, and laid it in the cedar chest beside the unfinished quilt. His hand lingered on the wood. He whispered her name once, not in despair but in reverence, a farewell spoken too long in coming. When he turned, Naiche stood by the hearth, her braid gleaming in the firelight. She did not ask what he had done. She only met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw not replacement, but renewal, the truth that love, once buried, could take root again without erasing what had come before. Spring spread across the land in the days that followed. The cattle grew restless in their pens. The soil softened. The sky carried the scent of rain and grass. Eli saddled 2 horses one morning, and when Naiche stepped from the cabin, he offered her the reins. "Ride with me," he said simply. They rode together into town, the prairie rolling wide around them, the horizon endless. Not as a cowboy and a stranger, not as protector and guest, but as 2 souls scarred by loss who had found one another in the quiet firelight of winter. The road stretched ahead, and for the first time in years, Eli Cutter did not see it as a burden to be endured, but as a promise yet unbroken.